Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 2 of Morgan Latif Presents. In this episode, I'm joined by Shereen Daniels. Shereen is the founder and director of HR Rewired, the HR consultancy focusing on anti-racism and racial equity. We talk about what organizations can do regarding equity, diversity and inclusion, the fact it's about both doing the right thing and that it makes business sense. We have the discussion around leadership and the impact that leaders can have on culture and the fact that they can change it. And finally, we tackle the discussion, can leaders actually change, especially regarding their values and their belief system? We hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Hello, Oliver. Thank you for having me.
First of all, before we get into the topic, it'd be great if you could just give an introduction to yourself so everybody watching and listening knows who we're talking to.
Cool. Well, I'm Shereen Daniels, founder and managing director of HR Rewired. So we're a HR consultancy that specialises in anti-racism. We have collectively unlocked about 50,000 global conversations about race. So we know a thing or two about anti-racism and racial equity. So yeah, that's us.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And I know it may seem like a bit of an obvious question, but just taking this from a business perspective as well. So what do you feel that the main benefits are that both employees and organizations can have from having an anti-racist and inclusive culture?
I think it's fewfold. I think one is we're running out of time where it's a choice. Do you know what I mean? I think you just have to get on and do it now. The knowledge that we now have since the death of George Floyd last year, or the murder of George Floyd last year, and the subsequent things that we've seen unfold, after, during the last 9 months, has meant that organisations are under pressure to respond, and that response means they've got to show that they're doing something. And I think this is the difference between what I call pre-2020 diversity and inclusion, that still never talked about race or racism, and now this focus on equity and advancing racial equity, meaning focusing on Black colleagues, their experiences, how they can grow and develop within the organisation, but also how safe they feel. And it isn't enough now to rely on your HR policy. It isn't enough to say that you have a zero tolerance approach to racism. The general public are going, what are we doing? Or what are you doing? Your potential candidates are going, what are you doing? Your employees are going, what are you doing? And the investors are now very much focusing on, it's not just about what the visual representation you have in your business or on your leadership team. So, you can't just get away with having one Black person or one other ethnic minority in inverted commas. They're like, what are you doing to impact that? And I think that's been a real change, I would say, since, in my 17 years of HR, no one's really too concerned how you get the number. And, if you've got one or two non-white people on the board in senior positions, nobody asks you any more questions, whereas now that's changed.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're having so many more discussions where people are a lot more purpose driven as well, and they're making purpose-based decisions on the businesses that they choose to work with, being a lot clearer than that in their mind, rather than just settling or choosing a job or career for different reasons.
Absolutely.
You mentioned a quota there, and it's a conversation that we could probably spend half an hour deep diving in.
No, what, half an hour, Oliver? We need about 2 days. We need about 2 days to get into that one.
It's really split opinions, and I don't still know if I have a really fixed one on it. But do you think having a quota is enough, or is a bad thing then?
I'm a bit like you with this one. It's like I see. So the rationale for having a quota, I understand. So, and this is something that I always have to remind executive leadership teams about, is the reason why we had to put quotas in is because left to choice, no organisation is doing anything. So that's why the quotas became an important way. It's like the stick. Do you know what I mean? It's the epitome of the stick approach to go, you know what, you've been talking about diversifying your business, you haven't done anything, so now we're going to pin you to quotas. When you look at some of the quotas that the FTSE 100 companies all apparently signed up to, and the fact that, you know, in this year it was reported none of them have, you know, a Black person on their board, or, you know, in that time. So the progress has not only been slow, it's gone backwards from that point of view to when, you know, they first started talking about quotas. So it's a stick approach, and it's to force change, because on their own, organisations aren't doing, leadership teams are not doing enough. The unintended consequence of quotas has led to, because we've never spoken about racism and therefore why we need quotas in the first place, or we've just fixated on there's a lack of visual representation, and that's the start and end of the conversation. We've never talked about racism, what's led us to this point, where it came from. So the unintended consequence of that is there is a narrative that if you see anyone who isn't white in certain senior leadership positions, they only got in because of the quota. So this narrative that says you are dumbing down on quality to allow other ethnic minorities to get in through the door, which meant there's a question about the capability and the skill sets of those individuals who do get this position. So not only are they thinking, am I only here because of whatever protected characteristic they've been, you know, right? So that's going on in their mind. The other thing is they're also thinking, are my colleagues thinking that I'm actually not good enough at my job? And what we're seeing over the last 9 months is some of the comments from some of the colleagues of all levels of seniority has been, well, we're not anti-equality, but I don't understand why we have to lessen the performance threshold for our business just to get in more different people. And this is the issue that we have to tackle. And this is what happens when we don't talk about racism, because that in itself is racism, and they don't even realize it. That is racism, because that's assuming that it's like the idea that we live in a meritocracy, and organizations in a meritocracy. So what they're saying is the fact that we have pretty much all white boards or majority white senior leadership teams, irrespective of where they operate geographically, using the UK as an example. You know, London is almost 50-50 split in terms of white people and other, you know, multicultural ethnic minorities, but yet you can step into a head office in London and it still be 99% white led, and nobody questions that. So the question if there's no talent doesn't actually make sense when you're in London that's 50-50. So like, where does that come from? And so this idea that the lack of visual representation is because we are not good enough, ethnic minorities are not good enough, is unfortunately part of the issue that we've got to solve as well in this. And that's why I always say, like, I understand why we need quotas, but because we don't talk about racism, we don't talk about systemic racism, institutional racism, the fact it's not just behaviours, there is a general lack of understanding about why we need to do some of these things in the first place. And I think that's a challenge when organisations are now finding themselves having to act on racial equity. This is the first time many of them have had to hone in on Black people, and it's making them quite uncomfortable. They don't know enough. And so they're either trying to rehash what they've done before and hope and just put Black or BAME in front of it, right, and hope that's enough. But when they do that, they increase the risk of being called out for being performative and tokenistic. And it's purely because they haven't taken the time to understand the issue. So I know there's a lot in with all of that about the quotas piece, but this is where we are now, and why a lot of organisations are struggling. And that's why we're seeing so many public mistakes being made.
So there's no right or wrong answer whether the quota itself is a good thing, but it's really, and that was one of my questions actually, what are companies doing wrong? And it seems like just not talking about it and not creating the culture around the quota and the conversation that's actually the important piece.
It is, yeah. And you've got to, and I think, you know, we've technically, you know, I always say, if we imagine that the clock started ticking from the murder of George Floyd, you know, we've had 9 months really, do you know what I mean, to talk. Do you know what I mean? So this is so the challenge a lot of the institutional investors are saying is, right, you've had long enough to have the conversation at a board level about what you're going to do. So now we need to see action. The challenge is some of those organisations haven't even had the conversation because they thought this would be a passing thing. So they thought by the time something else would happen, we're still dealing with COVID, we've got all of these other challenges. And clearly, as we were talking just before we came on air, so to speak, right, there's so many things happening that is resurfacing this conversation or the lack of conversation about race and racism, which means, as I said, that organisations are kind of running out of excuses for why they're not only talking about it, but now moving into action.
I think that's a really fair comment, and I'm always interested in learning about what companies or leaders can do to actually solve that problem and be more inclusive and anti-racist. And outside of starting the conversation and being open and talking about it, what other things can businesses do to improve in this area?
So I think one of the things, because of all the work that I've done with clients all over the shop, from the BBC, Duke of Edinburgh, Nando's, Total Jobs, you know, fintech, public sector, you know, private sector, startups, the lot. The first thing is you've got to recognise the problem. So I always say to executive teams, you're recognising the problem. You don't need an encyclopedic knowledge of racism, but you do have to there's got to be some foundational knowledge there. But also you have to assess the state of readiness for your organisation to do something about this. And that will be predicated by your comfort levels, right? So how uncomfortable you are is almost going to dictate how much work you do or don't do in this space. But you have to work, you have to have that conversation and challenge each other around the board to go, how do we want to show up in this space, right? Because that is going to set the tone. Having that conversation up front will also save you a lot of money doing things that actually are not going to make a difference, because there's a lot of that going on. So recognize the problem first. The next thing is you've got to analyze the impact. And that is, if you are in an organization that has Black colleagues, not every organization does, but if you do have Black colleagues, you want to be understanding their experiences, because to some extent, your culture is potentially perpetuating racism in ways you don't know. They will know that. So if you don't have a culture of talking about racism, they've never had the opportunity to be seen and heard. So you have to go back to them and say, okay, we're ready to listen now. And that's when you understand the impact of racism within your culture, within your organization. The next bit is you've got to create a plan, right? And that plan has got to be based on evaluating the data points that you have. So all the traditional things that we know, attrition rates, promotion rates, pay gap, where you get your new talent from, how you appoint people into certain positions, who gets glamour projects, right? What decisions about what people decisions are made outside of your normal processes. So you're going to evaluate that data as well as the qualitative stuff that comes from the stories and the experiences. Then you're going to think about the actions that you can take that will make a meaningful difference rather than just demonstrate that you're doing something. So, and I'll give you an example. Unconscious bias training is not a meaningful action to address dismantling racism or advancing racial equity. If you're going to do some training, how about ways to prevent racial discrimination or racial harassment in the eyes of the law? Because there's been changes with the law this year. Or helping your colleagues understand what racism is, you know, so you kind of go through that and you want to evaluate it according to how easy it is to implement, but also the level of impact. And that goes back to, again, your how committed you want to be to this. And then the last thing that you need to think about is the safety net. You know, how do you enable all of your colleagues to keep going with this, knowing that there's this discomfort, know that there's this fear of saying and doing the wrong thing. So people will make mistakes. And contrary to the media, within organisations, we don't always operate a cancel culture as a way to encourage people to act the right way. So you have to create a safety net that says, if they fall over, how are we going to pick them back up, providing it's not gross misconduct? So this is not about overt forms of racism. This is about when people just might use the wrong language or say the wrong thing. You don't want them to retreat back to, I'm so worried I'm not going to do anything. So you've got to set the net safety net, you know?
Absolutely. No, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think that is a real fear about how to address the topic, and often it is easier just not to say anything, unfortunately, than to take the risk. And so it's about creating that environment and the safety net, like you mentioned. I am really interested in cultural change, and I
Yes.
think this is some companies are already much better at this than others, and a lot of the time it starts with the leadership, and also in the interview process, and bring this back to HR. So about the people that you're bringing in to the organisation, are there ways that you can identify in an interview process, in your eyes, how inclusive a leader might be, and how open they are to this topic?
I think so. One of the things which is really interesting is I was talking to a very large media buying agency, one of the largest in the world. And what they were saying is they've noticed that a lot of their candidates have now specifically asking about ESG stuff, what they're doing. So they're talking about climate, what are you doing about climate change? What are you doing about racism? And they're using that, even very senior people, and they're using that as a barometer to decide whether or not they want to join the business. And what's really interesting, and I do talk about this a lot, is this is not about Black colleagues asking the question. This is about everybody. So it's got nothing to do with skin color, because what the feeling is that to be truly inclusive means you have to be willing to tackle one of society's biggest taboos, right, which is racism. And therefore, if you're stepping into an organization that is already open to not only having the conversation, but doing something about it, I, as a transgender individual, I, as a woman, I, as a disabled person, I, as somebody of a particular religious affiliation, feel safer in that environment, because there is a recognition that racism is such an issue that by dealing with that, you actually create a better environment for everybody to feel like that their lived experiences are not taboo and are accepted, and they can truly be themselves. So it's really interesting that I think where some people are quite binary, thinking this is just about, well, we need to prove to Black people. And I'm like, no, that's not it. People are using this as a barometer of how much are you walking the talk? Because you can talk about diversity and inclusion all you want, but if you don't have an issue about how you're tackling racism and how you're going to get to equality through practicing equity, that's a signal that that culture is not going to be right for them. And that's what some leaders have never thought about it that way, because they're still thinking this is about the statement on the website or what they can say to the press if somebody comes knocking on a slow news day, rather than almost what your silence and your apathy, both from what you say publicly, but also what you commit to internally, how that is creating a story that you probably don't know. And that story is that you're happy with the status quo, you're happy with your business to look and stay the same, even though society is telling you that it can't, because we're now part of a global community and the world has shrunk because of COVID-19. So your lack of action will look deliberate.
So you think that all of the communication around inclusion, around racism that a business does is almost filtering the kind of people that will want to be part of that journey and part of that culture and business anyway. Yeah.
So I'll give you a really nice example. So one of the things that I get asked a lot of is who's doing what, right? So everybody, because they know I've read a lot, over 1,000 Black Lives Matter statements and anti-racism commitments and published D&I reports. That's a lot. So, and I never hold individual companies up to, because we all know what you can say on the outside is very different to the inside. But what I will say is that through that process of searching in my team, looking for who's doing what, the absence of information is telling in itself. So there is a point, I'm going to publish a list of FTSE 100 companies and the stuff that they're doing. It's just a link. Where there are gaps is where people ask questions. So what I'm saying to some of my clients is, you don't want gaps. because people will put 2 and 2 together and come up with 37. Now you're sitting within your leadership teams thinking, we're deeply uncomfortable, we don't know what to do, so we'll just take our time. But that's been perceived as when all of your other peers or your competitors or other industry leaders are kind of stepping into their discomfort and going, it doesn't matter, we're going to do something anyway. It looks very obvious that you're not doing something. So I always say to them, imagine your company name comes in an Excel spreadsheet. Are you happy that under a commitment and or some sort of action, there's a blank next to your name? If you're happy with that, that's fine. But I'm not sure everybody else will be, you know, and that's kind of, and that's where we're starting to get to. And it's the same thing for environmental factors. It's the same thing for governance. This is why, you know, ESG factors in terms of investors looking at who they think is a sustainable business for the future and now honing in on that even more. There is so much money going into impact investing because they're seen as more sustainable businesses. So almost by not tackling some of these issues, you're putting a very red flag on the rooftop of your business to say that we're not convinced we're still going to be relevant in 5 years' time because of our inability to address some of these issues.
So if just doing the right thing isn't a good enough message, then it's also a commercially really smart thing to do as well.
Correct.
You mentioned COVID-19 and it's changed a lot of things. How much of an impact do you think it's had, if any, around the conversation around racism?
I think it's been twofold. I would say the first thing is that globally, COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted, you know, minoritized communities. Yeah. And you cannot have that conversation without asking the question, why is that the case? The issue why that is the case is because of systemic racism, meaning you have a lot of minoritized individuals in frontline operations roles. So think about our health system, particularly if you even just take the UK and the NHS, if you think about the proportion of people who are frontline, who don't have the opportunity to work from home, right? Then we think about, you know, I always say to people, think about if you had a visual makeup of your organization according to hierarchy, right? Where are most of the minoritized colleagues? They're in low level positions. They might be receptionists, they're security people, they're cleaners. They're still people that are still needed, even despite we're living in a COVID world, because the office buildings still need tending to, the streets still need, you know, London Underground is still working, you know, all of these things. And so because they're in these positions, they're not afforded the same protection almost that comes with when you're in a senior position, when you know you not only can you work from home, you can probably work from another country and isolate yourself. That's the extreme. Yeah. Right. So you've got all of these people in frontline operation roles who are not progressing anywhere because of whether it's the glass ceiling or the concrete ceiling, dependent on what factors are at play. Then you've also got the disproportionate health outcomes, irrespective of COVID-19, because of our inability to talk about how racism impacts different communities and how they're able to ask for help. Then you have the history of the medical profession and how they've dealt with minoritized individuals. There is a history of people being operated against their will. They've been treated like lab rats. There's the whole history. So it's when we're having these conversations about the impact of COVID-19, it isn't just about mental health and well-being from being locked up at home. It's a converging of all of these societal issues that we've never talked about. And COVID-19 has just exploded all of that and says, this is the consequence of that. So the consequence of not having, you know, fair access to health, you know, fair access to advancing within organizations from an employment perspective, disproportionate incarceration rates for Black people, for an example, all of these things means that we are more vulnerable, not because we're less than, but because of the positions that we have within society. Does that make sense? Yeah,
no, it doesn't. I've also learned a little bit there from your answer, so thank you for the insight there. A lot of what we're talking about is change, and bringing this back to cultural change and leadership change, do you think on an individual level that leaders can change in terms of their views, their behaviours and actions, and ultimately, eventually, then their hiring, which is then really going to drive the culture and change in the business? But that does come often from the top management. Do you think people can change?
I think they do, provided they're ready to do a level of introspection that they're going to feel quite uncomfortable with. So if I think about, I always have like my gold star CEOs. And the reason why they're gold star is not because of, they've come up with like a 15-point plan and they've executed and it's amazing. They're gold star because they have done a level of introspection and reflection, and they are willing to recognize that some of their values and their belief systems, there's some things that they need to unlearn and relearn, right? But what they've not done is they've not stopped in that and gone, when I'm finished, then we're going to go and do something as a company. They're going, I'm doing this, but at the same time, we're still going to commit to action, so they're of the JFDI, do you know what I mean? Like, we're not, because I can no longer sit in ignorance and claim I don't know that this was an issue. I can't say that anymore. So now I've got to make the decision and crack on. So I think, and this is where it goes back to why I always say you have to recognize the problem, you have to assess the state of readiness. And the state of readiness is about the individuals around your virtual boardroom table. To say, if you're still thinking, well, we're gonna do this, we're gonna become more inclusive, we're gonna advance racial equity because it's a compliance issue, you can get away with not doing any introspection. But what happens is you'll have a tick box approach to this. It won't be genuine, and you're not going to create the culture that you want to publicly talk about, because fundamentally you only deal with issues from compliance perspective when they arise. So the state of readiness piece is massively important, and I think those that are willing to be brave and demonstrate what I call moral courage, which is sometimes to be the first, and or potentially to go, I want our organisation to be this type of organisation whereby we just don't talk about being not racist by definition if we don't have a racist bone in our body, but we recognise that the society we live within isn't structured fairly. So we want to do what we can, at least within our bubble of the organisation, to affect a greater amount of change and make progress quicker than society can, because we have more resources at our disposal. And I think those are I call them the brave leaders, because they're still the exception, rather than the norm. And I think if you can listen to this conversation, even our conversation, and think about, actually, where do I sit with this? Because where you sit with this, there is a direct correlation between how your organization will show up. It's becoming more and more obvious every day. And for some people, that's a positive pressure for them to get a move on. And for other people, that's deeply uncomfortable, because they don't want to let go of those ingrained beliefs that the world is ultimately fair, because it means to question how they got their position. And that asks some very uncomfortable questions. Is it because I was the best, or was it because I knew the right people? Was it because my skin color never was a factor and was actually a positive when I'm going for a non-executive role, a chairperson's role, a CEO role? They are deeply uncomfortable questions to ask, and not everybody is willing to do that level of self-reflection. You can tell the ones that have done, because their businesses show up in very different ways in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as when we're talking about hiring, and even more, this has been accelerated with COVID, but people are now hiring not for people, but it's really what value can they bring to my business. And especially because more and more we were restricted to talent in particular areas, it's now actually a lot more people you can access diverse talent pools, different regions, and we're now hearing that conversation. What are they going to achieve and bring, and not who are they? And hopefully that will accelerate that discussion as well.
Yeah, completely.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a really really insightful and open discussion, and I've learned a lot, and hopefully people can take away some great let's say actions, and also emotions and thoughts as well from this conversation.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.